To tell you the truth, when I was asked to be here today, had it not been for caller ID and recognizing our lovely president's voice on the phone, I would likely have thought it was a prank phone call. I have had birds all my life. I basically have led a charmed existence in aviculture because I've always been encouraged both by family and mentors. And mentoring is so important. And I hope all of you, they can't hear me? Well, with my big mouth, now they can hear me, right? Can anybody not hear me? Thanks. I've made some notes, but I probably won't pay much attention to them. My mom used to tell me that I had a problem because I would just start my mouth running and go off and leave it. And when I'm talking about birds, that's pretty easy to do. But I actually started with birds in 1945 at age 7 with a pair of canaries. I'd had finches or had pigeons and bantam chickens before that. I was always fascinated with the little flitty birds, so I would try to trap the sparrows and keep them in cages. And one day my dad came home from work, and I'd been successful in one of my trapping ventures and had some birds in a cage, and they were flitting around. And I, see, Dad, see? He said, turn them loose or I'm going to paddle you. That's cruel. And I heard him go in the house and say to my mom, for crying out loud, get that kid something he can keep in a cage. So the very next day, she went to our family barber's wife, who raised canaries, and said, Letha, I need a pair of canaries for Bob. Well, they were like family in our small town, so, I'd known them. Her husband had given me my first baby haircut and everything like that. So she gave me a really good pair of birds. They were installed in a cage on one of those hanging stands in the dining room. We cut a salt box in half and tied it in the corner and gave them some nesting material. And she started nesting. Well, her little tail would stick out through the bars, and I could go along and pick her up by her tail and peek at the eggs and the babies. And from that time on, I was hooked. It was just so fascinating to watch those eggs hatch, the babies grow, everything like that. Well, as time went on, I managed to get some zebra finches and some society finches. And, my parents were so patient. I raised these things in my bedroom. And I remember I came in from outside one day and my mom was bent over vacuuming, and she realized I was behind her. She stood up, turned off the vacuum, and kind of sighed and said, thank God you weren't twins. But, they still indulged me. So I moved on then from budgies to cockatiels and on up the ladder and until in '69 when they started actually allowing the mass importation of parrots. And then I sold an antique collection and plunged headlong into the large hookbills. The antiques were a lot of trouble to dust. I had a lot of ornately carved furniture. And I've never been sorry that I made that decision. But it's kind of interesting how your life evolves. At the time I was collecting antiques, of course, bear in mind that my folks were farmers and loggers. And my dad thought I was out of my tree. What are you buying that old junk for? Well, Dad, it's an antique. There's not a new supply. Well, and it'll increase in value, and where are you going to find another idiot that's going to pay? And I heard the same thing when I got the exotic birds. When I went through my fancy chicken phase as a teenager, he was supportive of that because he could eat the eggs and the meat. But the exotics, he could see no earthly good in having these fancy birds that were, in his estimation, worth nothing. And I finally convinced him that in today's society, the more worthless something actually is, the more valuable it is. And think about it, it's really true. But I've just led a charmed life because as things progressed, I got acquainted with people in Southern California through folks who had moved to Oregon from Southern California. And they allowed me to pick their brains. When I got old enough to travel on the Greyhound bus to California, I would go down and stay for a few weeks. I would go down and stay with Fern and Russell Hubble in San Diego. They would take me to other breeders. Through them, I met the late David West and Velma Hart, who became close friends and mentors. David was the one who actually pointed me toward Tom Ireland in Florida, where I acquired the first blue Quakers. When the blue ringnecks came in, I was always fascinated with genetics, actually. And I had a good mentor in genetics here in Oregon. A gentleman by the name of Bill Hanning had a large commercial operation in Silverton. And he kept about 10,000 breeders. And he a master at genetics. And we didn't have the books then. He just figured it out and knew what to put with what to get what. And he was willing to share his information. And there were times when I would call and say, Bill, I want to come up. The folks are going to bring me up and buy some more birds. And he'd say, okay, come on up. And then he'd have a pair or two set aside, and he'd say, okay, now I'm going to give you these, and I want you to take them home and set them up. Then when they produce, I want you to explain to me what it took to produce those colors. So I learned hands-on, and that's been so valuable in working with the Quakers. But back to David and the blue Quakers, as Nancy mentioned. The first ones were very small. They had been bred blue to blue. They were weak. I searched all over. I called David West and said, I've decided I want blue Quakers. Do you know of any? He said, well, there were a couple people here in California that had them. Of course, they're illegal. But I don't know if they have them any longer. So I checked with them, and they said no, they didn't, because they were afraid they would be confiscated and euthanized. And at that point in time, a pair of blue Quakers was $2,500. So I finally managed to find Tom Ireland in Florida, and he was cutting back on his collection at that time due to illness. And he said, well, I have 5 birds, 2 pair, and the single chick I raised last year. But I will tell you in advance, they're small. The color is poor. But I still want $2,500 a pair for them because they're rare. So I said, well, I want them. So we got them. When they came, he wasn't lying. They weren't much bigger than English budgies, I kid you not. The color was kind of dull and dingy. But this was in 1989, and we still had access and had in our aviaries good, strong wild stock. So we were able to split the blues up and pair them with normal greens. Well, when we brought those first generation hybrids or splits in, they just sat there like little conures. Normally baby Quakers, for those of you who don't know, I think that's why they're named Quakers. The babies quake. they're absolutely the most fun of any baby to hand feed as far as we're concerned. And we brought them in. We'd been accustomed to feeding the normal greens that were very animated in their feeding response. And these little first cross splits just sat there like little conures to be fed. And David said, "Oh my God, they bred the quake right out of them." So it took us 2 generations to get the quake back in Quakers. So it's amazing how word of mouth travels, and you know, this we weren't even working with the internet at that point in time. We weren't advertising. The phone kept ringing. "We hear you have blue Quakers." Well, yes, we're going to have eventually, because it took a while to get enough that we could actually sell some. So we had a waiting list. And more people would call, and blue Quakers were at a premium for about 10 years. So we did very well with those as far as the financial aspect was concerned. And that gave us the funding, so to speak, to venture into the first Lutino when it became available. And then go on to the gray factor stock that we were able to acquire and everything. And it's been exciting. We've been able to trade back and forth, and it's been an exciting ride. But I need, after saying all of that and giving you that history, I just have to say that you know, people think I've done all of these wonderful things and on and on and on, but when you stop and analyze everything that I have accomplished has been the result of someone else's help. When I had a problem, when I was feeding the large birds or something, I would get on the phone and call Velma. Velma, I've got this horrible problem. And she always had the stock answer. "Now, first of all, honey, just calm down and we'll get to the bottom of it." And she always managed to figure it out. It was amazing. It really was to me. When I had my first African grays, I was so thrilled, so proud of them. So I babied them. You know, they got the absolute best care I could imagine. One day I went to feed them. They bobbed their little heads and it all came back up. And I'm going, oh, they've got fungus. My head was spinning. I called Velma. Velma, I've got this horrible problem. I fed the grays and they irped it all back up. What am I going to do? She said, "Well, how old are they? Are they feathered?" I said, "Oh yeah, they're almost fully feathered." She said, "Are they nice and heavy?" I said, "Oh, they're like little chunks of lead." And she was a smoker and had kind of a raspy voice, and she laughed and she said, honey, their crops are starting to shrink. Instinct tells them they've got to lose that baby fat so they can fly. You're overfeeding them. You're being too good to them. If you're concerned about this, just feed them a little bit more often. Things will be fine. Just calm down. So, that kind of help is what helped me make it through. And I try to help other people that way. And I hope everyone else does as well. It's important that we keep mentoring people and keep passing on and handing down what has been so graciously given to us. Because if we don't, aviculture as we know it is going to be gone. We simply have to work at passing it on. And I'm very concerned about that. After the large birds started being imported, it seemed like the smaller species were cast aside. Of course, I've been in it long enough to remember when the psittacines were in very short supply. When I was a kid growing up, parrots were so rare in the state of Oregon, I think I could probably have counted every parrot in the state on my fingers, literally, with the exception of budgies. And even in the 50s, cockatiels were scarce and rare. A lady by the name of Mrs. E.L. Moon, who lived in the East and later was the quote-unquote curator or babysitter at Parrot Jungle in Florida, wrote a book called Experiences with My Cockatiels. And that was kind of like my Bible as far as cockatiel husbandry was concerned, because she was the only one that had been successful with them. And one of her stories was that she had to keep up with her housework and things when she finally had some baby cockatiels. And her hand feeding technique was to chew oatmeal in her mouth, keep the cockatiels in her apron pocket, and feed them from her mouth as she was doing her homework or her housework. We didn't know about E. coli and all of these horrible things then, Funny story, and I haven't even, Brent is always pumping me for stories, This is one I haven't even told you, Brent. About 1971, a friend and I made a trip down to the South Bay area to pick up some then very rare yellow red rumps. They were the first red rump mutation to surface. And on the way back up, we came up the coast through, can't think of the name now. Anyway, the guy's name was Perry Linder. He was a retired school teacher. And it was in August. It was fairly warm. And I was bringing back, he had a very big mixed collection. And I was bringing back some pheasants for a friend of mine here. And as we were talking, we walked around and he said, well, it's a little late, but I have some African grays in the nest and some baby thickbills, if they survive the heat. And I said, well, why don't you pull them and hand feed them, Perry? And he said, my wife won't allow birds in her house. I said, I'd get a new wife. He said, well, he said, it's a little late now. We've got great-grandkids. But, I can't imagine not having baby birds even in the house. I can imagine the mess of large birds. And we don't keep birds in the house other than the babies. The babies are hand-fed in the den, and then they go out. I was raised that way. I was raised on a farm. The animals had their space, the chickens had their space, and we had ours. There were few exceptions if there was a problem, but there again, they had theirs and we had ours. So as we were walking around, I said, gosh, Perry, San Diego Zoo has just raised 1 or 2 thickbills. You're probably the second person in the world to breed them in captivity. It's a shame to let them die. And I said, what would you let me have one for out of the nest? And he thought for a minute, and he said, well, you're doing me a favor by taking these birds up to Oregon for this other person. So if you want to gamble, you can have one for $15. I said, okay. It's a gamble. And really, I hadn't fed that many large birds. We got in the car, my friend was driving, and he said, how are you going to feed? I said, don't worry about it. So the next town, we saw a Safeway store, and I said, pull in here. So I went in and got some oatmeal. And he was driving, and I opened the oatmeal, and I didn't think he was paying any attention. I chewed it up and held a little thick bill up to my face, and it ate just like a champ, And when he realized what I had done, he turned green, I swear. It was just incredible. And as soon as we got home, he said, if you decide to do that again, you tell me, and I'll stop and get out of the car. When we got home, he said to his wife, do you know what this idiot? So there's been a lot of craziness along the line, too. But, Velma went to her grave without ever having heard of E. coli. She'd never heard of Candida. When she taught me to hand feed, she said, a woman would put baby formula to her wrist. But, you work, you're probably not as sensitive as a woman would be, so I would suggest that you just touch it to your lips. And if it feels just warm, then it's okay to feed it. So that's the way I did. Well, when David came to work for me in 84, we were feeding a bunch of I was feeding a bunch of baby scarlet macaws. That's the reason he came there. I had a pair of scarlets that would lay and incubate like clockwork, and then as soon as the babies hatched, they'd eat them. So I'd pull the eggs at 21 days, put them in the incubator, and they'd all hatch. But then it was every 2 hours, and I had neighbors that would come in and feed while I was at work. I worked swing shift, and I'd get home at midnight and then break into my sleep every 2 hours. And it was about to kill me. So people I was selling birds to brought David down from Puyallup, Washington to help me. They didn't care about me. They were protecting their source of supply. But anyway, I mixed some formula, said, this is how I feed it. He said, okay. And things went well for a while. One evening, I got home at midnight, and he met me at the front door with this long face, and I said, uh-oh, what's wrong? He said, the baby macaws have stopped digesting. And he was young enough, he was playing the macho bit, but he had tears in his eyes. And I said, well, I don't know. So we called Marilyn Paul in Sacramento, who just passed away a couple of years ago. She was my last living mentor. And she actually became David's mentor, because if he had a problem or a question when I was at work in the evening, Marilyn said, call me, David. I'm up half the night feeding babies anyway. I'm always here, and if I can help, I'll help. So when I told her what was going on, she said, "It sounds like you've got candida, Bob." And I said, "Can what?" And she said, "Yeast infection." And I'd never heard of it. So she said, "How hard are you feeding the formula?" I said, "Well, I showed David how I was feeding it." And she said, "You're not using a thermometer." I said, "No, never have." She said, "Well, you need to. People's sensitivity varies, and even if the same person isn't feeling well, their sensitivity varies. So it's important that you check it accurately." "Have you got a thermometer?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, have David mix some formula, and I'll bet he's feeding it too warm." Well, he did. He said, "This is how I've been feeding." It was 110 degrees. With the macaw's big crop, it was promoting yeast infections. So she told us to